get started there. So go ahead and get your outline open. You have an outline for that. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we are now going to do some notes. Not yet. Period 3 will end with Chapter 7, Jackson. So we are almost there, but not quite. Almost there. Okay, so the very last part of Period 3, okay, for the College Board framework is basically, we call it the Federalist Era or the New Republic. Think like this is, the Constitution has been ratified, now what? And it's that first two presidents. The end of Period 3 is the election of 1800, was the election of Jefferson. Okay, so we have two more presidents, Washington and Adams, and then we are done with Period 3. Okay, all right, so a couple things I want to point out, okay? The nation's first capital was not Washington, D.C. That does not exist yet. It's going to be New York, okay? And if you've ever been to the Wall Street area, like near that bull, if you ever touched it for good luck, there is a big statue of Washington going like that, and that's where he delivers his first inaugural address. And again, it's in New York. So the first capital is New York City, okay? Then while you'll see, but they'll move it to what is now called Washington, D.C. They won't call it that until after Washington dies, okay? But while it's being built, they will temporarily move the capital to Philadelphia as like an interim capital, getting closer and closer to what is now Washington, D.C. So again, it's New York City, Philadelphia temporarily, and then finally Washington, D.C., okay? And James Madison, remember, he wrote the Constitution. He was one of the authors of the Federalist Essays, and he wrote this. I think this quote just really sums up that New Republic era. We are in the wilderness without a footstep to guide us, meaning, yeah, we have our independence. Now what? And you can see we can easily be successful, but probably the chances everyone's kind of just watching us to fail. Okay, so people are worried about the presidency. Why? Because all we know is England had, I guess you could say, an executive branch, we don't even call it that, but England's central government, parliament, and King George III, abused their power, and so we don't want to be like a King George III, okay? And some people, like John Adams, actually suggested, how do we address the president? And it was like, Your Majesty of most like royalness. And it's like, that sounds a little, monarchy. There's a lot of awkward things going on, okay? So you will see that Washington will create what's called a cabinet, okay? And he will set lots of, it is Chapter 7, Ruthie, Chapter 7. It says constitutional government takes shape, okay? So with this, he creates something called precedents. Okay, precedents is not presidents, but precedents are what you call traditions. Okay, for instance, when he was sworn in, usually you place your hand on the Bible or some religious book, and all this stuff. He added, "So help me God." That's one thing. Okay, other than that, another precedent is the cabinet. The cabinet is a group of advisors. Okay, just pretend like if I'm president. Okay, I know about education, but do I know about department, like energy stuff? No. Do I know about war? No. Okay, so I am not the expert there, so I would ask people to be heads of departments, and then the Senate would approve of it. So it's like, I I don't know what's going on. Someone ask it, people who I trust to be my advisors, and that's how we have the cabinet. The original cabinet just had 4 positions, 4 departments. Okay, you had Secretary of State. Okay, when we talk about state, think foreign policy. I think that's a little misleading. Secretary of War is Henry Knox. Remember, Henry Knox was the guy who did the Fort Ticonderoga, like moving the cannons and stuff early, like in 1775. And then you'll have Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Okay, Alexander Hamilton was from the Caribbean in 1776. So, the war's already started. He actually moved to New York City. Okay, he played a big role stealing cannons in the Battle of Long Island. Remember that? Washington evacuates and stuff. And then from that heroic thing that Hamilton did, he gets the eye of a lot of people. And like Henry Knox wanted him to be to help him and stuff. He said no, and then Washington actually personally asked him to be his secretary. And again, we think secretary in this sense, it's like the person who's keeping the journals, writing down things, whatever Washington's doing, he's taking notes. And they will form a really close bond. He basically views him as like a son. George Washington does. And so then you have the Constitutional Convention where he represents New York there. Okay, he is a Federalist. He wrote the majority of the Federalist essays. Okay, and then promise I don't have COVID. I just allergies. But with that though, he gets a lot of attention there. And so then when you have Washington, who is the first president who's unanimously elected in 1788, he's like, oh, you know what? I know a lot about Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury. Okay. Jefferson will be asked to be his Secretary of State. And what's interesting here is he was in France at this time. And that will really shape his foreign policy as Secretary of State for Jefferson. Okay. And then the Attorney General is Edmund Randolph. He's from Virginia. And the Attorney General is basically like your head prosecutor. So think a lawyer. Okay. And he's prosecuting like the head, like for federal crimes. Okay. Want to point out in 1791, the Bill of Rights will be ratified. Okay, remember, 1788 is when the Constitution is ratified, and the Anti-Federalists said, we will sign off on this and ratify it, as long as you promise that after it's ratified, you will add a Bill of Rights. Okay? Here we go. Okay, right there, just want to point out that's Washington's cabinet. Okay, if you notice, who is not included there? A lot of people get this part wrong, but who is not included? It's okay, Crystalline. Think about a title. Who's someone that you would assume would be part of the cabinet, but actually is not? Yes, Karen. The vice president. Okay, good, Kasia. A lot of people think the vice president is part of the cabinet. No, the vice president, John Adams actually said the vice president was the loneliest job in America. Okay, because you really are a substitute, and you are only needed if the president can't do something, and you're basically not included unless the president needs you to be included. You are not a member of the cabinet, okay? And technically, you are like the president of the Senate. And with the Senate, the only power you have is when there is a tie, your vote is the tiebreaker, okay? Other than that, you're just there, a substitute, okay? So I just want to point out, Washington's, or just a cabinet in general, the vice president. So Pence is not a member of the cabinet for Donald Trump. Okay, here is the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And amendments means changes. And again, the Bill of Rights were added after the Constitution was ratified. Okay, and this would make the Anti-Federalists happy. And if you notice, I circled it where it says 1791. So you know this was after the Constitution was ratified. Okay. And we know that James Madison, father of the Constitution, also wrote and got these ratified. And these 10 amendments limits the powers of the central government, the national government. So you can also say it also protects individual liberties, like the right to bear arms. Number 3 says Americans will not have to will never be forced to quarter troops. I mean, that's definitely like intolerable acts, right? So we're learning from what happened to us, and we're going to try to prevent that. So you can see that quartering of troops really like hurt a lot of people, like scarred them. So they want to make sure it's in the Constitution. Okay. So next we have this act called the Judiciary Act of 1789. Okay. Please make sure you do need to know the date for this. Okay. Judiciary Act of 1789. And just remember, that's the year that Washington becomes president. So just remember, the first president will start in, it's like April of 1789. The same year as the French Revolution is the same year we have our first president, if that kind of starts. And it's the year of the Judiciary Act of 1789. Okay, want to point out in the Constitution, okay, talk about the judicial branch. The only branch that is mentioned, or the only part of that, is the Supreme Court. Okay, it doesn't really even say how many people are on the Supreme Court. It basically says Congress can decide. Okay, so what this act does, it's like, okay, first of all, how many people will be on the Supreme Court? And like, here's a country and we have one court. Like, that's not going to work. Eventually, as more people are going to come to America and have babies and all that kind of stuff, people are going to break the rules and need to settle things and, you know, civil courts and stuff. And we need a court system. Okay, so the Judiciary Act of 1789 created a federal court system. If you see right here, I've circled system here for you. Okay, this did not establish the Supreme Court. The Constitution did that. But what about, we need, you know, that's not a good idea of just one court. Okay, the system of how you get to the Supreme Court. Okay, y'all know that the Supreme Court is the final jurisdiction. They have the final say on things. They're the final court of appeals. That is all from the Judiciary Act of 1789. You can see for each state, there's a tax court. There's 97 district courts in 1789. Okay, there's veterans appeals. Okay, because remember, a lot of veterans still haven't gotten paid. Remember Shays' Rebellion and stuff. Okay, and you see there's just how certain things work. You need to have this organization so you know like how to go, because again, the Supreme Court is only one body, and we need to have a system, and that will be the Judiciary Act of 1789. So established a federal district. Yep. In each state. Okay, it also said the Supreme Court the president will appoint a chief justice and 5 associate justices. And again, that's the only court mentioned in the Constitution. So you technically have 6 justices on the original Supreme Court. And of the 6, 1 is the chief justice. Okay, and remember, how do you get on the Supreme Court? The president appoints, but the Senate holds a hearing to approve or not. And remember, it might have been last year, the year before, there was a spot opening, and it was weeks and weeks and weeks of Kavanaugh, who was up with something about like sexual harassment, sexual misconduct allegations back like in high school. He was, you know, the Senate investigated and put him on like a hearing, and in the end, when the Senate voted, he did get the nomination. So that's that example of checks and balances. Okay. Now Washington, he's all about trying to keep the peace. Okay, we know there's Federalists and there's Anti-Federalists. Remember, they're not parties. There's also a lot of like North versus South. You can see from the Constitutional Convention with the 3/5 compromise, there are some people who were like, you favor the North, you favor the South. So Washington really tries, almost like a parent, to like favor the different regions. So he's going to choose 3 justices from the North, and 3 from the South. And he's like, I'm not picking favorites. You know, I'm being fair. Okay. The first Chief Justice is a guy named John Jay. You've heard about him because he was one of those who wrote the Federalist essays. He probably wrote the least amount of the Federalist essays because he had arthritis really bad. But he will be our first Chief Justice. And you will see, I think it's tomorrow when we talk about this, but I mean, he also helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So he is a diplomat. But with Washington, he is the first Chief Justice. And there is a time when Washington's president where he will send our Chief Justice to negotiate a treaty with England. And it's like, that doesn't make sense. Like, Chief Justice, why not our second, you know, that kind of stuff. But it'll make sense later. All right, so the first court case is Chisholm versus Georgia. Now, I'm going to tell you this right now. Do not worry about all the details. Okay, I'm going to kind of glide over it just a little bit, so don't worry about filling out everything with Chisholm versus Georgia. Okay. All right, so here is a little cartoon about Chisholm versus Georgia. Little background information is that this has to do with during the American Revolution. Okay, there was a South Carolina merchant who loaned like supplies and money to the colony of Georgia during the American Revolution. Okay, the state of Georgia. Okay, so just, okay, now that the revolution is over, blah, 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 blah. Okay, the merchant actually dies. Okay, and there's a lawyer. But you don't have to worry about this part, okay? But like the lawyer looks at the estate because, you know, there's like a will and inheritance, and he notices that there is a debt owed to the guy who just died. And, you know, that should go to the family, the will, you know what I'm saying? The estate. And so the lawyer goes after the state of Georgia, okay? And basically, the state of Georgia owes my client $500 from the war against Great Britain, which is a lot of money back then, okay? Well, we are not paying it. We don't have the money. That's what Georgia said. We don't have it. Sorry. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm suing you to get the money. So they went to the Supreme Court. That lawyer is suing the state of Georgia to get that money. You can't sue the state of Georgia. You don't even live in the state. Yeah, it was a guy from South Carolina. So you see, it's kind of awkward. Okay. The court rules that Georgia must pay the money to Chisholm. Okay, and then what's going to happen is that people are saying, you know, that's really kind of sketchy, okay, that someone in another state can sue a state for like monetary reasons, okay? So from this, you will see people are talking. Citizens from one state should not be able to sue another state. It kind of weakens the power of the states, okay? That's the last time a citizen from one state will be able to sue a different state. That will be our next amendment. And long story short, we will get the 11th Amendment from this. It's not part of the Bill of Rights. Okay, so significance is that basically it makes people mad, and eventually it will become an amendment. Okay, so in Chisholm versus Georgia, it does say, Georgia, you have to pay that person. A non-resident can sue a state for money, okay, for damages, okay? People are really upset about that because, again, some people really want the power of the states. And this court case weakens the power of the states, okay? So eventually, in case you don't know, there's only, I think, 2 ways to overturn a court case. One is an amendment, which is definitely like more permanent, if you will. Because it's, I mean, we've only have like 26, 27 amendments right now, okay, in 2020. Or you can have another court case that basically overturns it. And remember, Supreme Court justices, for the most part, can serve for life. And, you know, for instance, like right now, like in 2015, the Supreme Court who was on there who said that, you know, the federal government does recognize same-sex marriages. It was a very liberal court, okay? And what's not to say 20 years from now, what if you have a very conservative court they could do the same thing and overrule it. Okay, so do you see, there's only two ways to overrule a Supreme Court. One is just have another Supreme Court ruling, overrule it later, or have an amendment, which is more of like a protection, because it should last longer. Okay, so there's that. All right, so now let's go to Washington. He will serve 2 terms, and we all know 2 terms. That will be 4 years each. And remember, the election is an even number, but you don't start until the next year, okay? Okay, so remember, election, even number, but then you don't start, kind of like with Donald Trump. He won in November 2016, but he didn't become president until 2017. Okay, just remember that. So he only vetoed twice. That is unheard of. Remember, he's really trying to like keep the peace between, you'll see lots of different regions are going to hate each other, and different types of people are going to hate each other, and he's trying to keep the peace. Okay. He's going to work really, really hard to balance, okay? And we're talking about he wants to keep the peace, really. He's focusing on between the northeastern merchants, so think like Boston, New York even, okay? And the southern planters. We really think Virginia here. Okay, remember in 1788, he is unanimously elected back then. The Electoral College is the official body who chooses the presidency. And every person, every electorate has 2 votes. So what that means is the first round, every single Electoral College member said Washington. So he was elected unanimously. Okay, then the second round is like, okay, who gets second place? That's how it was back then. First place, president. Second place, vice president. And that's where like people had differing opinions, but John Adams got second place. Okay, so that's how it worked back then. We'll have an amendment later that will fix that. Okay, he was nonpartisan officially. Okay, because think about it. When he becomes president, political parties in America do not exist yet. They will develop during his presidency. Okay, so he is nonpartisan. Now, officially, he is nonpartisan. But when push comes to shove, he tends to be more of a Federalist. He tends to side with Hamilton. And we'll get to that. Okay. If I were you, okay, he is against political parties. Okay, because again, he saw them develop in his cabinet. The first 2 political parties in America develop in front of his eyes in his cabinet. Okay, and before it's a political party, it's called a faction. Okay, a faction is a group, and I would just circle the word faction. A faction is a group of people who have one goal in common. Okay, so for instance, the Anti-Federalists were a faction. Their goal was don't ratify the Constitution. Okay, once a group of people have more than one goals, then you become a political party. Does that make sense? So he does not like factions because factions usually become political parties. All right. And he did believe that the proper role for your ordinary citizens was not to set policy. He believed that the more educated people who had more experience and more ownership, think land ownership, in the America should be the ones setting policies for everyone else. Okay, so that's kind of unique. All right, so now let's talk about Alexander Hamilton, okay, and his policies. Okay, remember who is Alexander Hamilton? He's the Secretary of the Treasury. So think money, economics, taxes. You know, we're in the hole a lot after the American Revolution. Okay, we have a debt. Okay, if you total it all together, it's about $75 million back then. Okay, so just remember that. Okay, it says 54 million, but what it is, it's 54 million plus other things as well. If you talk all of it. Now remember, Spain and Holland and definitely the French, they didn't give us stuff. They loaned us money. They loaned us stuff and said, hey, you know, pay us back, kind of thing. Okay, the big figure, if you combine, because you know, remember, Every colony back then, individual colony, had their own debt. And now they're states, okay? So each state had their own state debt for what they paid in the American Revolution. Plus, like America and the Continental Congress had a debt from like France, okay? And that, so the state debt's 54 million. But then you add it all together and the total debt is around $75 million back then, okay? And how do we know about that? Is he went to Congress and gave a report, but this is a speech, on public credit, okay? And he said, Congress, here's the number, 75 million. That's how much we're in the hole, okay? And he said, we are a young country, and if we default on this loan, meaning like kind of like declare bankruptcy and say, oh, we don't have it, he says that's going to really hurt our reputation. And if we ever need loans from other countries later, they wouldn't give it to us because they know that we've already defaulted on one loan. Why give us another loan? So he said, here's the debt. I'm going to come up with a plan to pay off the debt, 100%. Okay? And again, that report is called the Report on Public Credit. In case you don't know this, credit equals debt. Okay? For instance, a credit card, okay? You use it, and it's a temporary loan, and then hopefully you pay it off. But it is technically a debt. Okay? So credit means debt. And again, he said we need to pay it off 100%, okay? And he has a plan, okay? Now, this is a little weird, okay? But do y'all see? So now we're on the back side, okay? Do you see where it says be fat? Okay, I know it's kind of awkward, but it's a mnemonic device that will really help you out here, okay? This is his plan, and there will be, we'll like spill it out in just a second, but just know be fat actually is like a mnemonic device for his plan. But let's go to the actual notes part, okay? So we're going to pay all war bond holders. So a war bond, okay, is basically a fundraiser where citizens and non-citizens can buy a war bond, and that money is a loan basically. What's interesting about it though, since it's a war bond, it goes straight to the military. So the Continental Congress sold war bonds, and people, even like French people even, bought them. And it was like after a certain amount of years, they're supposed to get it back plus interest. So it's like a way to say, hey, we support the war effort. Here's the loan through a war bond. It goes straight to the military, and then we'll get it back later plus interest, okay? And he says we need to, all those Continental Revolution war bonds, we need to pay them off in full. And one way to do that is we sell new bonds. Now, technically, these aren't war bonds because we aren't in a war, but we can sell new bonds. And so it's the idea of a perpetual debt, and it's the idea of, okay, we're still going to be in debt, but at least we're going to be paying off the pre-existing debt, okay? So keep a perpetual, like means ongoing debt. Okay, so yes, we know this is not really solving the problem, but we're solving the immediate problem of checking these people off our list. Okay, so that's one way to get revenue to pay off those Revolution war bonds. Okay, also, he says another way to create revenue, remember that's government money, is to sell Western lands. And in this case, we're talking about, remember the Northwest Territory that we talk about the land ordinance and stuff. So remember the land ordinance like divided the land up into townships and square plots and stuff. And basically it's like, look, let's sell that land and let's just make it known that that land will go fund this debt that we have. So again, sell bonds to pay off the pre-existing bonds. And then the money from the Northwest Territory land purchases will go to like be funneled into this debt to pay off this debt. Okay, look at letter D, okay? This is a specific thing you have to write down. And it says now territory, Northwest Territory, sorry. Okay, so this blank right here, pay off state debts, it's the assumption of state debts. Okay, now, so that's the noun version. The verb would be assume state debts. Okay, remember I told you how all the states combined, $54 million, okay? He basically believed what we should do, remember this is Hamilton, he's a Federalist, meaning like Federalist essays, played a big role in the Constitution being, ratified and stuff. He believes that we should basically merge all state debts and then let the national government take it on. Like, it's the idea of let us relieve you from this burden, Georgia. Okay? We know that you have this debt. Well, you know what? Let us worry about it. You need to worry about just Georgia. Okay? Now, do you see? That's some people are like, oh my gosh, that's amazing that the central government wants to take that responsibility off of us. Okay, but some people, like Jefferson of Virginia, is like, no, Hamilton, I see right through you. You are slowly trying to mislead the people to where you are creating more responsibility for the federal government, right? Because if they are assuming this debt and taking it off the state's backs, that means the federal government or the national government is creating more responsibility, okay? Over time, that responsibility becomes power. You will see in U.S. history, there are times where the central government gets more power than it's supposed to. There are times where it goes back, but it's kind of like in waves. And so here's Jefferson's like, no, it says you can't do it in the Constitution. I see your plan. You're slowly trying to create more power for the central government. I'm not buying it. And again, though, who's Jefferson? He's Secretary of State. That's foreign policy. It doesn't have anything to do with this. But he's like, yang at the cabinet, okay? So again, the first big thing is assumption of state debts, okay? So just note, we will come up with a plan for that, okay? He also wants to have a tariff, which y'all know a tariff is an import tax. Basically, he wants to promote American-made industry. Okay, I believe like he really wanted America to be known as like the glass maker of the world. That was his plan, like factories making glass, okay? And he basically said we need to protect American-made goods by opposing a tariff, okay? And a tariff is an import tax, okay? And basically it punishes you for not buying American. So let's just pretend that the tariff is 20%. I think it was like 16%, but just for my math right now, let's say it's 20%. And let's say I order $100,000 worth of stuff. I'm a company from Italy. Let's just pretend, okay? And it's a 20% tariff. So my total bill will be $1,000 to that Italian company, right? Plus $20,000 to U.S. government. Why? Because there's a tariff, and the only way to avoid that is for me to buy American instead. So you see, the tariffs are actually the #1 way the government makes revenue. It makes its revenue. You've heard it, like we have income taxes today. Income taxes weren't around to the 19-teens. Okay, so the big money maker, revenue maker for our U.S. government, okay, until like the 19-teens, tariffs. They punish people for not buying American, okay? So you have to pay a percentage, and an additional percentage to the U.S. government, okay? And so again, how can you get out of the tariff? You buy American to promote industry, okay? All right. And then another way, so U.S. industry is the blank there, okay? And then another way, this is all about creating revenues for the most part, the excise tax on whiskey, okay? Whiskey is a luxury item. And, just like with alcohol and like cigarettes today and stuff, people say, hey, it's not a necessity, so we can justify taxing it more. Okay. Now, an excise tax, what that means is you pay per amount. Okay. Today, a great example of an excise tax is gasoline. Y'all know you know what it says, like so-and-so per gallon. Included in that gallon is an excise tax that goes to the government, okay? And you pay it for every gallon you get. So for every gallon of whiskey, there is a tax now you have to pay, okay? So you see just ways for the government to create revenue. There'll be a tariff. There'll be the excise tax on whiskey, okay? They'll be selling Western lands. There's also bond holders, like new bonds. Okay, those are all ways we're going to create revenue. And remember, he says, let's assume the state debts. But Jefferson's like, I think you're creating more power that way. Okay. So what's going to happen, and Hamilton does believe in the wealthy class. The elites should have more of a say-so because they're more educated. He doesn't believe in mob rule, the uneducated. He said that they aren't educated in politics, so they'd make foolish decisions. So look at number 4. We're talking about the letter E, industry. All right, so let's go back to number 4, assumption of, you see it, we wrote down assumption twice now, so make sure you know that. Okay, so there were some states like Massachusetts, South Carolina, Connecticut, okay, who hadn't paid anything, okay? But for instance, Virginia, they paid off their debt already. Okay, so you see, some people are like, oh, so you're going to rescue those who weren't responsible and haven't paid off anything. Okay, so you see, there's tension here, but also again, people like Jefferson saying, I don't buy it, Hamilton. I think you're trying to slowly create more power for the central government, disguising it as like we're saving you from this debt to the individual states. So what's kind of cool is how this is settled is there is a very top secret dinner meeting. Okay. And it's called the dinner table bargain, okay? And basically, it's where James Madison's there, Thomas Jefferson's there, Hamilton's there, and just a few other people. Very, very, very hush-hush. And Hamilton's like, Jefferson, like, what gives? Like, we need to assume state debts, okay? And they bargain, they come up with this thing, shake hands like a gentleman's agreement, okay, behind closed doors, okay? And Jefferson's like, I'm okay with this, but what Hamilton offers Jefferson is something Jefferson really can't refuse, moving the capital. Okay? Now, in case you don't know this, a chunk of Maryland and a chunk of Virginia was taken out of those states, and that's what creates Washington, D.C. today. It actually was some swamp area called Foggy Bottom, okay? But it was, so you see, that's the South, okay? It wasn't New York, okay? And Hamilton says, Jefferson, what about moving the capital to your backyard, basically? And Jefferson's like, that's pro-South right there. I'm okay with that. And they sign off on that at dinner, okay? So you see, what convinces Jefferson to be okay with assuming state debts? Moving the capital to his backyard, which was now it's called Washington, D.C. Okay. Also want to point out, remember I told you about tariffs? He goes to Congress and gives something called the Report on Manufactures, which basically says, hey, we need our economy to be based off of industry. And how, and you know, I'm butchering spelling right now. And how do we promote industry? Through tariffs, which I already explained, okay? And so again, Congress is the one who can pass tariffs. Congress has to approve of all these things, okay? And then the last thing, which I think creates a lot of drama between Hamilton and Jefferson, is the Report on the National Bank, okay? Do you see how we're going to be making lots of revenue? And we need a place to store that revenue, that money, okay? So he asked Congress for a charter, 20 years, for a national bank called the Bank of, it's the Bank of the United States, not Bank of America, Bank of the United States, okay? Well, this is where Jefferson steps in again, and he says, no, there's nothing mentioned in the Constitution about a national bank. Jefferson is really worried about the federal government creating too much power, getting too much power. So he's like stopping every single time, okay? And he says, no, this is unconstitutional. The word national bank does not exist in the Constitution. Thus, it should not be allowed, okay? You will see that Hamilton and Jefferson, Hamilton has a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And Jefferson has a strict interpretation. Jefferson saying if it's not in the Constitution, the national government can't do it. Okay, Hamilton, I think he looks more for loopholes. He says, well, if it doesn't say I can't do it, then I'm going to assume the national government can do it. Y'all know there's some people like in the syllabus, well, it didn't say I couldn't have my cell phone out. You get what I'm saying? That's Hamilton. Okay, and so Hamilton will go to Washington, like George Washington, and he says, I kind of found a loophole. There's something called the elastic clause, which you might remember. It's the phrase necessary and proper. Okay, so there's something called the elastic clause in the Constitution, which says if there is something that is not listed in the Constitution, but it's necessary and proper for the national government to have, then it'll be constitutional. That's like the ultimate loophole, because anytime the national government wants to create more power, you just say, throw elastic clause at it, okay? And Washington's like, okay, that makes sense, and then Congress will sign off on that, okay? It is very controversial. Andrew Jackson, for instance, and that we're talking the 7th president, he's fighting the bank too. A lot of people who are more about states' rights do not believe the national bank exists. And this is for decades, but it starts here. But it's the idea, Congress says, let's give it a 20-year charter, see how it goes, and then let's see if we need to renew it or not. So it will get a 20-year charter. Okay, so I think it should expire like in the 1810s or teens, I guess you could say. Okay, so opposition, Jefferson says the bank's unconstitutional. Hamilton, he'll use the what clause? Elastic clause. Okay, and I would underline where it says 20-year bank. Okay, and do not worry about Hamilton's legacy. We're good there. Okay, so I want to show you a couple of clips. Okay, about all this stuff. Okay. And some of it is from the John Adams miniseries. There we go. Hold on, not that. Here we go.
You must find Philadelphia much changed.
More change than I could have imagined, Mr. Hamilton. Not the city itself. All cities swallow everything in their weight.
That's no surprise to me. That's why I abhor them. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department.
No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the South.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
Sadly, that is very well said. But there can be no question our nation cannot bind together without powerful central government. But we must also accommodate the needs of our constituent states, both North and South. The power of one must check and balance the other. To that end, we must dedicate all of our energies and our care.
I would like to welcome Mr. Jefferson home. Mr. Secretary of State.
Here.
Mr. President, gentlemen.
There are cabinet matters that I would like to discuss. If you would excuse us, Mr. Adams. Please convey my regards to your wife.
So now this is where we break it down, because you can see I talked about it for like 10 minutes about Hamilton's plan. And so if you can break it down to this mnemonic device, it will really help you out. Okay? So this is where we do the little BFAT thing. Okay, just remember the debt is $75 million, and here are some things we have. So first thing is what I talked about is the F, and F means funding at par. This sounds really fancy, okay? It's a legal term. Funding at par. What that means is pay existing bonds at full face value. Now we know how we're going to do that by selling new bonds. Y'all know sometimes when people can't pay you what they have, they'll settle and say, well, I can give you this much instead. No, he's saying we're going to pay the full amount of those bonds by selling new bonds, but we're going to pay it off full, okay? Then we talked about how are we going to deal with this debt. What's the A? We're going to assume the state debts. And, you know, think about it. It's probably easier to pay off two if one body pays it off instead of like, you know, 13 different ways. Like, no, let's just accrue this debt and one government's in charge of paying it off. Okay. Now, how can we also pay it off? Let's go to T, tariff. Okay. To promote American-made goods. There is a tariff, and he actually wanted like a 20-something% tariff. Okay. Congress did not agree to that high of a tariff, but they will agree to like it's in the teens. You don't have to know the agree, but you know, there is a tariff and it's in the teens of that, what percentage. Okay, let's see. E, the excise tax on whiskey. That's another way to create revenue. Now, one thing that didn't make it here would be the selling of Western land. So you could do like BFATs with an S if you want to sell Western lands. Okay, and from the revenue of the new bonds and the tariff and the selling of Western lands and the excise tax on whiskey, where should this money go? A Bank of the United States. That's the B. And that's the part that really made Jefferson get like a hissy fit, because he's like, it's not in the Constitution. Remember, elastic clause trumps it all. Okay, let's see if I left anything out. Okay, so last thing I'm going to show you is, I bet some of y'all have seen this before, from Hamilton. Again, just remember, the first political parties in America did not begin until after 1789, okay? And it develops in the cabinet between Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton, okay? And there's something called a cabinet rap battle you're about to watch, and it's all about, should we assume state debts?
Ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. Are you ready for a cabinet meeting? The issue on the table: Secretary Hamilton's plan to assume state debts and establish a national bank. Secretary Jefferson, you have the floor, sir.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals, we shouldn't settle for less. These are wise words, enterprising men quote them. Don't act surprised, you guys, cause I wrote them. Ow, but Hamilton forgets. His plan would have the government assume states' debts. Now place your bets as to who that benefits. The very seat of government where Hamilton sits.
Not true.
Oh, if the shoe fits, wear it. If New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Our debts are paid, I'm afraid. Don't tax the South, cause we got it made in the shade. In Virginia, we plant seeds in the ground. We create. You just want to move our money around. This financial plan is an outrageous demand, and it's too many damn pages for any man to understand. Stand with me in the land of the free. Pray to God we never see Hamilton's candidacy. Look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what's gonna happen when you try to tax our whiskey.
Thank you, Secretary Jefferson. Secretary Hamilton, your response.
Thomas, that was a real nice declaration. Welcome to the president. We're running a real nation. Would you like to join us?
Staying mellow, doing whatever the hell it is you do in Monticello.
If we assume the debts the union gets, a new line of credit, a financial diuretic, how do you not get it? If we're aggressive and competitive, the union gets a boost. You'd rather give it a sedative? A civics lesson from a slaver. Hey neighbor, your debts are paid because you don't pay for labor.
We plant seeds in the South.
We create, you keep ranting. We know who's really doing the planting. And another thing is, to age of enlightenment, don't lecture me about the war. You didn't fight in it. You think I'm frightened of you, man? We almost died in the trench, or you were off getting high with the French. Thomas Jefferson always hesitant with the president. Reticent, there isn't a plan he hasn't jettisoned. Madison, you mad as a Hattison. Take your medicine. Damn, you in worse shape than the national debt is in. Sitting there useless as two shits. Hey, turn around, bend over. I'll show you where my shoe fits.
Excuse me. Madison, Jefferson, take a walk. Hamilton, take a walk. We're going to reconvene after a brief recess. Hamilton, sir, a word.
You don't have the votes. You don't have the votes. You're gonna need congressional approval, and you don't have the votes. Such a blunder. Sometimes it makes me wonder why I even bring the thunder.
Why he even brings the thunder? You want to pull yourself together?
I'm sorry, these Virginians are birds of a feather.
Young man, I'm from Virginia, so watch your mouth.
So we let Congress get held hostage by the South.
You need the votes.
No, we need bold strokes. We need this.
No, you need to convince more
Well,
folks.
James Madison won't talk to me. That's a non-starter.
Winning was easy, young man. Governing's
They're being
harder.
intransigent.
You have to find a compromise.
They don't have a plan. They just hate mine.
Convince them
And
otherwise.
what happens if I don't get congressional approval?
I imagine they'll call for your removal.
Sir,
Figure it out, Alexander. That's an order from your commander.
Okay, so maybe you've seen that before, but I feel like now you have a better understanding of it. Like we talked about, they hinted at like imagine what's going to happen if we try to tax our whiskey, assuming state debt, all that kind of stuff. So now I feel like you have a better. If you've seen that, maybe you appreciate it even more now because it really was historically accurate. Okay, so that's it for notes, but now I got to do a little bit of LEQ prep. Okay, so I'm going to go over the types of prompts you'll be asked, and we'll do a little activity on that. That should be super. Okay, so this is a long essay question. We call it, can you see it from yours? Yeah, okay. It's called the LEQ for short. It's suggested you have 40 minutes on the AP exam. So the first one would be you'll have 50 minutes, and it will be online, clearly. So for today, we're going to focus on understanding the 3 historical reasoning skills and understanding the prompt. Okay? So for the College Board, when it comes to the types of prompts, there are 3: causation, continuity and change, and then comparison. All 3 are kind of similar and overlap, but they do have a different way of organization. Okay? So the first one is causation. It's basically your cause and effect. Okay? So when you recognize that, oh, what prompt is this? Oh, it's causation. In your head, you should think about something like this, where it's like an arrow leading to the effect, or it's like opposite, where it's like here are the causes, and then the effects would be over here. Okay, so they usually will describe the cause or the effect. Sometimes the prompt even asks you for both. Okay, so look at down here. It says explain the relative historical significance of different causes and or effects. You see how wordy that is? Explain the relative historical significance of the different causes. Good God. Okay, about 3 years ago, the College Board used something like that on the prompt. Okay, all that means is what were the causes, and you need to rank them. Like which ones were the most significant, which ones were the least significant. Okay, you'll see. It's just about being coached so you know what to expect. So that sounds wordy, but now you know. Also causation, okay? Evaluate the relative importance of causes which led to, okay, or evaluate the relative importance of effects which resulted from, okay? And then look at the other things, the T2s. Evaluate the extent to which blank caused blank, or evaluate the extent to which blank resulted from blank. What's the difference there? The T1 examples are basically you get a free range, okay? The T2 examples, it gives you specific things to address, and that means in your prompt that you have to address those specific things. It all depends on the prompt. Sometimes the College Board will give you specific things to address. Sometimes they'll just say causes. You're like, okay, I can work with that. Okay, so here, evaluate the relative importance of different causes for the expanding role of the United States in the world from the period 1865 to 1910. So whenever you see a prompt, you need to ask yourself these things. What is the historical reasoning skill? That's going to be causation, okay? I mean, actually it says the word causes there. Second, what is the overall topic? Okay, so it's talking about foreign policy. Third, are there any themes? Okay, so that, again, it's like expanding role of the world, foreign policy. Fourth, what are the parameters? 1865 to 1910. Next, we have comparison. Basically, think of Venn diagram. Okay? Explain the relative historical significance of similarities and differences or differences between these developments. Okay? So, evaluate the extent of similarities or evaluate the extent of differences. Okay, it's the same thing. Sometimes they'll tell you specific things you have to address, like in T2. Sometimes, like T1, they won't. Okay, and remember, in the end, you'd say, you know, there are more similarities or there are more differences, and the most similarity would be here. Okay, so evaluate the extent, which basically means how much, of the similarities between the Chesapeake and the New England colonies. So we know it's comparison, because it talks about similarities. The overall topic is Chesapeake and New England colonies. And then if there are any themes, don't worry too much about the themes yet, but I would say for me, I would do like geography and migration, but y'all don't know that yet. And then fourth, the parameters, 1607 to 1754. Next, we have continuity and change. You see, this is very similar. It's kind of like causation, and if causation and comparison have a baby, you get continuity and change. So this explains the historical significance of specific historical development in relation to a larger pattern. Okay? So evaluate the continuities. That means evaluate the things that stay the same. Okay? That kind of thing. Or the changes. Instead of differences, like in comparison, think changes. So here's an example. Evaluate the extent of change in the United States foreign policy in the period 1783 to 1828. So we know what's the thing. It says the word change, okay? If it says anything, if it says the word change, or it says anything like the word change, it's going to be the continued change. Okay, sometimes like impacted or was like affected. Affected is a good way. It says affected or change is going to be continued change. Overall topic, United States foreign policy. Don't worry about the theme 4, 1783, 1828. Okay, so look for causes. It says like here's cause, political cause, here's the economics cause, like what your paragraphs would be about. And then what they're saying is this belief part, the identity part, is the least amount of the causes of American foreign policy in a time period. For that Chesapeake and New England comparison, it's saying, hey, look, here's an example of a similarity. Here's an example of a political similarity, and then here's an example of these are differences, and then this is a similarity. And then for continuity and change, basically it's like, look, here's something that stayed the same here, here's something that stayed the same here, and then here is one change. Do y'all have any questions about the 3 types of prompts? So what I'm going to do, this looks like a lot, but I guarantee you, when I did it, because I created it, and then I did it, and I was like, man, this took me like 5 minutes to do, okay? You are going to do steps 1 and 2 today, okay? It's basically prompts. What the College Board tends to do is they take the standards, okay? So I looked at my blue notebook, and I basically turned the standards almost verbatim into a prompt. And you will see, I didn't mix them up. There are a lot of causation prompts because there's way more causation standards. So the chance that you would actually have a causation prompt is a lot greater than the other prompts, okay? So just note, you're like, oh my gosh, here's another causation one, here's another causation one, okay? All you're doing is there are 21 prompts, and again, you're looking at keywords, and you're just basically trying to identify what the prompt is, okay? I'm gonna post this. You may work in your group, okay? But if you can, like, what I want you to do is, if y'all do divide and conquer, someone else should be going back and looking too. So maybe like divide and conquer, but also like do a check too, okay? So I am assigning this right now. And remember, one person can turn it in, but everyone else needs to click turn in, okay? And what you do, okay, you just do steps 1 and 2. This is super easy. You're going to highlight, well, change the color, you choose, I don't care, okay? That gives away which historical reasoning skill it will be, okay? And then, next to it, I don't care where next to it, you write in bold which historical reasoning skill it is. And that's how it's listed, like in things. So CE means like cause and effect, or cause or effect, that's causation. CC is compare and contrast. And then CCOT is continuity or change, okay? So again, all we're doing is like highlighting the key words that give away which prompt it is, and then you write down which prompt it is. That's all we're doing with this, steps 1 and 2.